From Music City, USA, it's David Hooper and Music Business Radio.
From big studios in Nashville, Tennessee, it's Music Business Radio. I'm David Hooper, your host. Rounder Records was founded in 1970 by Ken Irwin, Marian, Leighton, Levy, and Bill Nolan. Filling their passion and enthusiasm for American roots music, lighting the way, the three Boston area college students cast their lot in the perilous music business. And I've got two of them here today, Ken Irwin, Marian, Leighton, Levy. Thank you guys for being here.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So 40 years ago is when you guys got started. Did you think it would last 40 years? Let's talk about that first.
We'll start from the beginning, and Ken can talk to that probably better than I can, but we actually did not think in terms of how long it would be, but we did envision it as a lifelong project.
So how did it start, Ken?
The idea actually came up when I was hitchhiking, as with most record labels. I think that's the way they all start. And I was coming back from a fiddler's convention in Galax, Virginia, and I was hitchhiking with a girl that I was going out with, and we were picked up by a couple, and they didn't want to see her hitchhiking at night, and they invited us to spend the night with them in Charleston, West Virginia. It turned out that the guy, Ken, had rediscovered a couple of old musicians who had recorded in the late 20s and early 30s and had started a record label. And he had a few LPs, and they were very simple. Photos were probably shot with an old Kodak, and I didn't know anything about lettering. They were block letters, and the covers were just, not the most attractive, no liner notes.
But great music.
Great music. And the next day we didn't have anything that we were particularly planning to do, and he took us out to meet two of the artists that he had recorded, Clark Kessinger, who had recorded, I think, for Brunswick, in the late 20s and early 30s as the Kessinger Brothers, an incredible fiddle player, and Billy Cox, who had written Filipino Baby and Sparkling Brown Eyes and a number of other things. The next day, they set us out by the road, and we hitchhiked back home, and I went to my college roommate and said, hey, this guy started a record company, and he doesn't know anybody that designs records, and we know Doug Parker, he designs book covers, and he didn't know anybody who wrote liner notes, and we knew some folklorists and ethnomusicologists, and so I said to my partner, Bill, why don't we start a record company? And there wasn't anybody there to tell us not to. And here we are.
And just to clarify, Ken and Bill Nowlin, our third roommate, were roommates all 4 years through college at Tufts from 62 to 66. So they were doing various things in sort of the folk music world around the Boston area.
Promoting shows or doing live events.
Putting up flyers and stuff like that on campus.
We were college representatives for a number of theaters and concert series where we would put up flyers in exchange for free tickets.
So you're the street team.
Yeah, we were street teams before there were street teams.
That's right.
Do you think, what brought you guys together? Because it seems like it's kind of an interesting coincidence. You probably discussed this in the past, I would imagine. Just you're hitchhiking, but what's the chance of these guys picking you up and it kind of changes the course of your life?
I think that's an absolutely fascinating question because, in fact, I think that is how people wind up doing the things that are most important to them. It's a series of sort of meaningful coincidences that you put together in the right way. Obviously, it's an amazing coincidence that Ken was picked up by his doppelganger, Ken, who was running a record company, and Ken decided...
In the middle of nowhere, it sounds like.
From the power of suggestion, it sounds like a scene from Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, to start his own record company.
And what would have happened if we had been picked up by the car before?
I was just going to say that, but I didn't want to get gruesome, because we've all heard the story.
The axe murderer.
Right.
Then there would have been no Rounder Records.
So when you guys were starting this, it was just like the love of the music. It was not thinking like, hey, 40 years from now, I'm going to be doing a huge show at the Ryman with the biggest of the biggest. I'm going to have Grammy Awards. We're going to be working with this dude from Led Zeppelin.
We didn't really have a goal. We wanted to put out some music. Back then, a lot of the records would have a little postcard inside, and it would say, where did you buy this record? And then at the bottom, it would say, are there artists you think we should put on our label? And we would fill them out, and they'd never write back. We'd get frustrated, and one of them, I think, wrote back in reference to a group called the Lilly Brothers, who played at the Hillbilly Ranch in Boston. They said, send us a tape, and we didn't have a tape recorder. We were just students. So we were a little bit frustrated, but we had all these ideas of people we had seen and whose music we really liked and thought really should be documented. And nobody would listen to us, you know. And so when this thought came about starting a record label, we already had a few ideas of people that we'd like to record. But even after that, even after our first two records, which came out in 1970, our only initial goal was to make one record which we thought would be a classic in a field. So if you thought about fiddle records, that we would have one of the great fiddle records that would make into the top 10 or a top banjo record. But we certainly didn't have goals. I don't know if we had even ever heard of Grammys at that point, or if we had, they certainly wouldn't have entered our consciousness.
I'm with Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. They're the founders of Rounder Records, celebrating 40 years. And talk about the name, Ken, Rounder Records.
When we were starting out and decided that we were going to put out some recordings, I don't think we really thought about a label per se. It was just, let's put out some of these artists that we had heard that we liked. We knew we had to come up with a name, and we just started throwing out ideas. We sat around, and I remember something about doorknobs, and ironically, there is one now, radiators. We just looked around the room, and the name Rounder came up, and we really liked that. A rounder is someone who makes the rounds, hobos, who we really identified with because we traveled around later on to festivals and around the Southeast in particular in a VW bus and ate a lot of peanut butter and, ate mostly in our car.
Yeah.
So we sort of identified with the hobos and other kinds of people that make the rounds, including prostitutes and night watchmen and low-down rounders and songs like Jimmy Rogers and a lot of the early blues and country.
Even Cops on the Beat.
Yep, absolutely. And records were round.
There's a rounder. More
right.
round.
You know, we got that for sure, and the Grateful Dead started a label afterwards called Round, and we were thinking someone was going to start one called Roundest, but that hasn't. Right. That's the part. Don't want to give anybody any ideas. Yeah. And also, very importantly, was a group that largely introduced Bill and I to old-time music, a group called the Holy Modal Rounders. They had been very influential to Bill and I. We had gone and seen an all-night fundraiser in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was a 72-hour hootenanny, gives you an idea of the time frame. And people would play in the storefront and raise money. And Bill and I snuck out of where we were staying at the time and watched these two guys, Peter Stamfel and Steve Weber, who later became the Holy Modal Rounders and also played with Fugs. Peter and Steve played for hours and hours and hours, and we later found out that they were the only artists who had discovered drugs and that they were able to stay up much later, and they won the prize, which I think was a banjo case, a really nice banjo case. But anyway, the Holy Modal Rounders introduced us to old-time music, and we then went back and learned from them about Gid Tanner and the Skull Lickers and Charlie Poole and the North Carolina Ramblers. And so it was nice having the records being round and the people who identifying with the hobos and the Holy Modal Rounders. So it was sort of like three ideas rolled into one, and we really liked that.
Well, and actually more than three ideas, because the whole notion, as Ken was saying, about low-down rounders and so forth, is a phrase and a term that's repeated over and over in so much of the early music that we really liked. And it's also, it goes back to, the literature of anyone from Woody Guthrie, other hobos on the, people who've traveled on the roads. Mm-hmm. And, even in movies of that day. I mean, movies that are made going back to, say, the Dust Bowl era or the Depression. The Rounders sort of feature prominently in the folklore of our country. So there's that. So it sort of enriched the whole notion. And then I'm a little younger than Ken and Bill, and also had the opportunity to hear the Holy Modal Rounders at the school where I was an undergraduate. This was somewhat later than when Ken and Bill saw them, but they were still the essence of, these sort of hip, psychedelic, old-timey banjo and fiddle player. And we just all loved the idea of Rounders. Hence, it just was like, oh, that's a perfect name. So, and then we never thought about it again.
I remember singing some of their music when I came home from college one year, and I was singing the chorus to Euphoria, and it talks about a belladonna cloud, and I had no idea what that was, but my father did. And he sort of wondered, well, what are you learning at college there?
Well, as a marketing guy, and this is the way I think a lot of labels are doing their stuff now, is they look at the market and then they said, well, this is what we can sell to that market. Did you guys look at the style of music you were putting out that way, or were you just completely fans first and you said, well, listen, this is cool and people are going to love this?
Well, since Ken has addressed some of the history of how the term rounder came about as the name for rounder, I'll just sort of answer that by saying that none of us ever had business courses, marketing courses. We were as much influenced by other record companies already in existence, not that we aspired to become Folkways or aspired to become our Hooley Records or County Records, but they were the companies that were most meaningful to us and doing the type of music that we liked. But no, we never thought about the kinds of people who might become our audience. I think we were as much doing it for ourselves as anyone else. And of course, very early on, we did start a little mail order company, and we did sell records on the weekend at bluegrass festivals, blues festivals, and so forth. So clearly, in the aftermath of the folk revival, which is when we were starting Rounder, there were young people in various parts of the country, pockets of, college towns and so forth, and a few of the major cities that had independent distributors. So our goal was simply to get our records in the same record stores that carried the type of records that we liked and had listened to and had influenced us to begin Rounder.
It sounds like you guys were going direct. You either had direct mail or you were doing like live from the back of the room, as we would call it. So distribution wasn't so much of an issue as it would have been 20 years later had you started.
Well, there scarcely was any. And so very early on, we became our own best distributor for the largest at that time region for record sales in the country, which was the Northeast Corridor. So New England and eventually down to New York and D.C. And then, as I mentioned, some of those college towns, fortunately, either had small independent distributors. San Francisco had a good little sort of alternative, as we would call it today, record scene. LA didn't. So it was all very spotty and sort of hit or miss. And if there was someone we could sell our records to, then we would, if we, whenever we found them. But no, there was no business plan or like, well, this is what we'll do in this market. It was all being grown at that time.
But I think since this is focused on business, we should talk about how we did that in the early days. Mm-hmm. That we would go around to festivals with our VW bus, and we had our 2 records and other recordings by some of the artists on labels that Marian mentioned. And we would go to the festival and we would set up a table, and table is in quotes. Sometimes they'd be hay bales, sometimes they'd be picnic tables, whatever we could find.
Whatever you could get.
Sometimes they'd be old boards, and we'd make them, and we'd put up our boxes of records, and we'd sell them. And we also had the mail order, as Marian mentioned, and we would call up a friend of ours back in the Boston area, and he would tell us what orders had come in, and we'd take the records, and we'd go to the local radio station. We asked them if they had mailers that they didn't need, and we'd turn them inside out.
Brilliant.
And then we would also go to the festivals and sell, and we'd take the money. At night, we were a little bit concerned, and we'd put them in our bank. And the bank would usually be a pair of dirty socks. We figured if anybody tried to break in, they'd never look for money. And we got great enjoyment in going to the bank the next day, and we'd go in and we'd start taking bills out of socks. Sometimes we'd put them in our hats, and we'd take the hat off and take the money out right in front of the teller. And, and it was great fun. So we'd take the money out, and then we'd get a money order and send it back to Boston.
Oh, that's great.
They'd put it in the bank for us.
Well, those are the kind of stories that I want to get into, and you're talking about making things happen. I know you've got some travel stories for me. We're going to take a quick break. This is David Hooper, Music Business Radio from the big studios in Nashville, Tennessee, with the 2 founders, 2 of the 3 of Rounder Records, Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. We'll be right back with more from Music Business Radio.
Coming to network television is the shocking new reality TV series, Holiday Shopper.
You've almost got it. Just a little bit left.
Frustration and phony Santa Clauses intertwine as 5 shoppers inside 5 different malls have 5 hours to complete their holiday shopping.
I'm sorry, sir. Our credit card machines are down. Do you have cash?
Do I look like I've got cash? What will happen when each of them realize they wasted their entire day fighting mall traffic, finding mall parking, and waiting in mall lines? You'll be on the edge of your seat in this prescription.
Change your holiday shopping habits. If you want unique gifts without the mall hassle, get to 1,000 Faces in Hillsborough Village, your one-stop for cool jewelry, great gifts, and original art. And don't forget your free Lightning 100 stocking stuffer sticker. It's 1,000 Faces, located in Hillsborough Village, a plethora of neat stuff.
rockabye. Hey everybody, I'm Sean Mullins. The most important thing I've learned since being in the music business is sticking to your guns and doing what you love to do. And you're listening to Music Business Radio.
From big studios in Nashville, Tennessee, it's David Hooper with Music Business Radio. With me today, the Rounder founders, two-thirds of them, Ken Irwin and Marian Levy. You guys founded Rounder Records 40 years ago. Here we are, a lot has changed. I wanted some early stories about making records, actual physical making records. Like these days, anybody can record a record really easily. They can put it up on iTunes the next day and it can go out to the world. It wasn't always like that.
In many ways, it was actually easier back then. I'm not sure that in this day and age we would have been able to figure out how to start Rounder as we did back then. Things seemed so very simple. For one thing, there were only vinyl records. You needed to, have a master and then get it pressed, and then you could order repressings. And when we started Rounder, we didn't, of course, use full-color covers, so we didn't have to worry about color separations. So there was the printer. So you dealt with the printer, you dealt with the pressing plant, and that was really it. And then they shipped the records to you, and you tried to get them out into stores. So there were no complicated, multi-layered, multifaceted ways of selling music back then. Of course, we're even talking about in 1970, it's pre-cassette, basically.
And there were no corporations, I guess, with a lot of mom-and-pop stores.
Precisely. And still a growing, but nonetheless at that point starting to be viable layer of independent distribution. So if you weren't with branch distributed major labels, you still could penetrate to the type of markets that would be interested in folk music and fiddle music and the kinds of things we were doing.
When we started out, we went to the local stores and said, here are our first two records. And they said, I'm sorry, get yourself a distributor. And there weren't a whole lot. We went to the distributor in town who represented Tacoma, which had Leo Kottke and Arhoolie and Rebel, and they weren't interested.
What was the reason they gave you?
2 records and no name artists. The first 2 records, one was a 2-finger picking banjo player from Union Grove, North Carolina, and the other was a progressive old-time band called the Spark Gap Wonder Boys from Cambridge. And neither of them had any kind of visibility, and the distributor just didn't see that they'd be able to sell any.
Plus, back in those days, too, they worried as often as not about whether you were going to still be in business in a year's time, because many people in our audience may not be aware of this, but the record business, like the book business, is 100% returns.
Right.
So, for example, there's no reason not to carry anybody's records as long as you have a place to return it to.
Right.
But if the company no longer
worried
exists...
about getting their money back.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then most distributors had what they referred to as the wall of shame, which are records that they purchased, put into the stores returned, and then by that time the company was out of business. So what we did is we contacted a few other labels that we knew about and said, we're a distributor in the Boston area, and we'd like to carry your records. And one of the labels, I think was called Oblivion, had another Leo Kottke record. They were one of the ones we contacted, and they said sure, along with American Heritage and lots of other labels that are pretty much in oblivion at this point, no longer in business. And we went back to the stores and said, we're a distributor, and these are the labels that we're carrying, and we were able to get our records in. So we started a distribution business. We contacted more and more labels, and one of these strange twists of fate, one of our best accounts in the area was the Harvard Coop that was located in the middle of Cambridge. And a distributor in New York went out of business and sold all their stock to the Harvard Coop at a very, very low price. I think it was 50 cents a record as part of their bankruptcy dealings. The Coop didn't want all the quantities that they got, and they contacted us and sold them to us for $1. So it was a pretty big investment buying them, and all the records started going into the house that we were living in and took over a couple rooms that would have been bedrooms otherwise. But we became a distributor. We contacted a lot of the labels that we had just purchased music from, told them we have 90% of their catalog and we're going to be selling it. Why don't they make us a distributor? They agreed, and thus Rounder Distribution was formed. We became a distributor, and we then had all those other labels when we went around to the festivals to sell. And we were in the distribution business for the next probably 25 to 30 years.
And, of course, the good thing about that is not only did we become our best distributor for the largest market in the country, which is the Northeast Corridor back in those days, but, of course, distributing our own records, we were both making the profit as a record company and as a distribution company. So it was something that was very helpful in terms of the margins back in those days to be able to sort of grow the company. So it was very good to be our own best distributor. At that point in the history of the record business, I think about a third of records sold in the country were in the New England, New York, D.C. areas, and most of our records were sold there too.
One of our best distributors for a while was in the San Francisco area, which was very similar to the Cambridge area. He initially was a taxi driver. When he went into a certain area where there was a record store, he'd just park his cab and go in and say, these are the new Rounder releases, and how many would you like? And he'd tell us and place an order, and then the next time the records would come in, and on his taxi route he'd stop by
and eventually he became successful enough doing that he was then able to start a distribution company and no longer be a cab driver.
That's a story.
It was a great story.
From the big studios in Nashville, Tennessee, this is Music Business Radio. David Hooper here with the Rounder founders, the founders of Rounder Records, Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. Marian, you mentioned that most of the records for you guys were in 3 markets, all on the East Coast: New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. So did that make touring easy? I mean, San Francisco, that kind of threw a wrench in it sounds like, for getting your bands out there. But was touring pretty easy? Did you stick to specific geographical areas, or how did you guys do things?
Not particularly. And touring was really something that was, I think it's fair to say, only getting kind of underway at that point. So many of the artists who became some of our biggest touring artists, their careers were only starting about the same time that Rounder started. So in the very beginning, we didn't think about touring, we didn't think about promotion, we didn't think all that much about publicity. Simply directly getting as many of the records that we could into the possible stores to sell it. But it is true that, for example, there was a circuit of bluegrass and old-timey bands playing in folk music venues and for folk song societies along the Northeast Corridor. And then we ourselves going to bluegrass festivals on weekends in the summertime, summer bluegrass festival season, could also then have a direct relationship with the people who were interested in buying those records by keeping a mailing list and, selling out of our little cardboard boxes in our VW bus in the summertime.
So you did have a mailing list, and I guess
we did maintain a mailing list.
And contacting them with maybe catalogs of the growing number of people you were distributing.
Yes, and our own catalog as it grew.
Because we got to think back 40 years ago, it's not like there was Amazon.com. Where are you going to get these kind of rare records? And it was a lot of times through the mail.
And there were some record chains that were developing around that time. Discount Records was a major one. And we had a friend in the Harvard Square store. When we put out a new release, he would take sometimes 10, sometimes 20, sometimes 30, and then ship them to the other stores around the country. And we also became friendly with Record Bar, which was a chain that was developing just about the same time we were. I think they might have even started in 1970. And for a while, we were right with them. Every time we put out a record, it seemed they'd open up a new store. Yeah. And they would send us an order, and we had the freedom to add to that order new releases, whether they were on Rounder or Rebel or whatever labels we were distributing.
Right.
So we started getting our music out to other areas of the country. It wasn't, the full distribution, and it certainly wasn't national distribution. That later evolved. We were also involved with the formation of an organization called NAIRD, the National Association of Independent Record Distributors. The idea for that was to share ideas and to talk about different labels and to see how we could all do a better job of getting records out and also dealing with the labels. And at our initial meeting, it was only distributors, and then there were a couple people who worked for Delmark Records. Our initial meeting was in Chicago, and they started banging at the door, and they thought that we were involved in a conspiracy against the labels. And finally, we invited them in. It was Bob Kester who started Delmark Records, and Bruce Iglauer who worked for him, who later went on to form Alligator Records, major. Both.
Yeah, and they're still up there.
Yeah.
Yes,
it's still doing really, really well.
Yeah,
that's another niche label too. Do you feel that you guys found the niche? Is that the reason that you guys are still around? It wasn't that you were trying to be everything to everyone?
Not really. I mean, we happened to be there about the same time as a lot of other people. who started their company maybe within a couple of years of the time that we started Rounder. But, I mean, Kester was around with his record store and starting Delmark before we were, so he was kind of an inspiration to us. But the other thing I was going to mention is that whole thing, as Ken was mentioning, Naird kind of grew up around the same time that Rounder started, and people were cooperating. That's how we learned about publicity and promotion and stuff initially, was by doing that.
If you could go back who you are right now and go back and tell the person you were 40 years ago, what would you tell them?
It's so difficult because of the fact that in these past 40 years, things have changed so almost completely. The people that we were 40 years ago wouldn't even, of course, understand much of the terminology.
I think we'd probably tell them, be wary of file sharing.
Talk about file sharing. What is...
That's great, Ken.
What are your thoughts on that? Because, I mean, nobody had computers back then, and it was a totally different vibe.
Yeah, the worst that happened back then, or sometime afterwards, we did know of people who made cassette copies and then would come up to an artist and ask them to sign their bootleg cassette. That was about the worst that it was back then. But, certainly we had no idea about what would transpire these 30 years, 35 years afterwards.
Well, and the interesting thing is that, go back to your question, because I think it's a wonderful question and you expressed it so well. Even the terminology, things like email or the internet. Of course, the internet had not been invented by Al Gore yet.
So one of the things we did, because before computers, to help us remember our catalog, we would number our records to make it easier. So Alison Krauss's first record was 0235, and then the second one was 0265, then 0275, 0285, 0325. So we numbered them so we could remember. So certain artists would have those numbers. They would all end in zeros or ones or twos. And
so they could kind of own their little numerical part of the catalog. And of course, as you can see, all these years later, Ken still remembers all those catalog numbers.
I'm amazed.
To the point of computerization.
Well, I actually noticed those on the website, though. That system is working for somebody.
Yeah.
So how has file sharing affected you guys? Has it been good? Because I guess on one hand, people can share the music and you don't have to worry about radio people or the music getting out another way. So it's sort of free publicity. But on the other hand, people can share the music and they don't have to purchase it.
The big negative for us has probably been a ripple down effect, because most of the music we put out, I don't think people are stealing. I think the vast majority of our artists have really very enthusiastic fans who will even wait months for the artist to come into town and buy the record directly from the artist. But the trickle-down effect has been very, very difficult for us, and that is that stores have gone out of business. Tower, just take a look at almost Virgin, almost everything. Records which we used to sell through brick and mortar retail, where there's an actual store, there have been over 5,000 stores that have gone out of business. So there are a lot of places where people used to go and take a look at records or CDs that just don't exist.
But again, I don't think it's entirely, clearly some of these things happened prior to the impact of things like file sharing and internet sales and so forth. So it's a very complicated question. It's hard to answer. I think that all you can say is that file sharing simply is, and some aspects of it are positive and some aspects of it are not.
Right.
In terms of the record store situation, I think a lot of that has to do with their own self-generated problems. And even going back to the early days of when we were talking about Naird, people were terribly concerned about trans-shipping back in those days, independent distributors who would sell into somebody else's market. So, these issues, even before things like the internet and so forth existed. And I was, in fact, reading a book about the early years of book publishing copyrights, for example, going back to Charles Dickens's era. And they were very concerned about that because there were bootleg editions of authors like Dickens who were hugely popular in the United States before they actually had an official publisher here, and other companies, in particularly New York, was a bootleg center.
Well, they'd run those lines at night, run the more vinyl than they maybe ordered. Once you got the stampers, you can do it.
And even before book publishing, what they would do is they would sort of rush the chapters from the English edition, bring it from the docks to a publisher, and do the latest Dickens. And of course, he was tremendously concerned because he was a hugely commercially successful writer. And this was money right out of his pocket. So many of the issues today with intellectual property and copyright go back, way back to the early days of copyright laws themselves.
Well, that was going to be my next question. What hasn't changed? And that sounds like it's one of the things that hasn't changed.
That's right. It kind of replays itself in different forms. Not to sound too philosophical about it, but I think that is fair to say.
Well, I want to dig more into that. We've got to take a quick break. From Big Studios, it's Music Business Radio. David Hooper here with the Rounder founders, Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. Now celebrating 40 years. More from these guys when we come back on Music Business Radio.
This is Fred James of Bluesland Productions, and if they'd had Music Business Radio in the late 40s and early 50s, Bullet Records and Excella would still have their masters today.
You're listening to Music Business Radio. Even if you can't get to Radnor Lake for a walk or bike ride today, you can still enjoy it with a 2013 calendar benefiting Tennessee's first protected natural area on its 40th anniversary. 12 photos by Robin Conover feature brilliant fall leaves, snow-covered trails, wildlife, reflections in the lake, and inspiring quotes. Everything you love about Radnor Lake's stunning beauty is captured in the 2013 wall calendar. The Radnor Lake calendar also makes a great gift for your friends and neighbors and a unique thank you gift for clients. Purchase your calendars today at the Visitor Center at Radnor Lake, Granny White Market, REI, and 1,000 Faces. Or visit radnorlake.org today to order your calendars online and help us preserve this beautiful natural area for years to come.
Hi, this is Jim Lauderdale, and I learned everything I know about the music business on Music Business Radio.
From Big Studios in Nashville, Tennessee, it's Music Business Radio. I'm your host, David Hooper. With me today, Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. They are the two of the three founders of Rounder Records. We don't have Bill here today.
No, Bill Nowlin is back. We're getting near the end of the pennant, and he is an avid Red Sox fan. In fact, Marian and I wanted to move south way back, probably in our 5th or 6th year, and no way that Bill would leave the Red Sox. And he's become a very accomplished and appreciated writer in the sports field and is the vice president of the Society of Baseball Researchers, I think.
SABR.
I
think it's fair to say he's one of the world's foremost experts on the Red Sox. And,
and Ted Williams.
I wouldn't miss it either.
And Ted Williams in particular.
Yeah.
So he's written numerous books on that and spends a lot of his time at the ballpark in the summertime. So,
well, let's talk about the strangest way you guys have found out about a new act. You know, we think about, I'll give you an example. When I told people that I was going to be interviewing you guys today, the emails come in because I said, well, what questions should I ask? They said, oh, how can you get us a demo? Because we want to be signed. And a lot of people think that's like the way to get signed. But I know that you guys are with hitchhiking and hopping freight trains and hanging out at Red Sox games. You guys are discovering music all sorts of different ways. What is kind of the most interesting way that you've discovered a new act?
Unfortunately, it's not really as strange or interesting or exotic or whatever glamorous as people might think, in the sense that, and it makes sense if you stop and think about it, the best and the most tried and true way that we hear about great new artists is from other artists. That's generally the simple, the fast and easy answer that is true in a very, very high percentage of cases. The interesting thing, because of course as we're taping this interview, we're in Nashville today because of the International Bluegrass Music Association annual convention. And one of the interesting things that's happened in the years, probably halfway through Rounder's history, is the founding of that organization. And now, including some of our most exciting new artists like Sierra Hull and new people that were Michael Cleveland, a wonderful fiddle player who's been IBMA's Fiddle Player of the Year, is they kind of have come up through the ranks of IBMA. So that's another way in which we now hear of artists. But In the first 10 years of Rounder's history, it was much more sort of hit or miss, and there are a lot of sort of fun and fascinating tales, usually not involving demo tapes. It's like someone who was perhaps a bus driver who heard a great little blues trio playing at his local VFW hall, like George Thorogood and the Destroyers.
Right.
Their early fans will just say, they'll come and they'll knock on the record company's door and they'll say, I'm telling you, there's no one like these guys. And that, literally a guy who was a Head Start school bus driver was the first person who told us about George Thorogood and the Destroyers, then bugged us for literally years afterwards. I would say it was probably 3 years after we first heard of them before we put out their first record.
So it's other people talking about the bands, not the bands talking about themselves.
That's right.
So there's a great lesson there.
Yeah.
When somebody else talks about you, it's always more valuable than you talking about yourself.
This was buzz before buzz was a word.
Yeah. And particularly other artists. And it is amazing to me, and one of the wonderful things in all of our years of doing Rounder, just how generous, in general, other artists are about artists that they are fans of. I just think it's one of the most remarkable things about music.
You mentioned George Thorogood, and I've actually got him on the list, which reminds me, I haven't even talked about the artists you have. I mean, it's like a who's who of music industry legends. I mean, you've got Rush now, just did this DVD with Duran Duran. But to take it back, you've got George Thorogood, Woody Guthrie, Irma Thomas, Steve Martin, J.J. Cale, Nanci Griffith, Bela Fleck, Riders in the Sky.
Mary Chapin Carpenter. I mean, 3,000 albums.
I think it's closer to 4, but we haven't updated the press kit.
just throw them on the pile, right?
Actually, our partner Bill did for quite a while, and then we've sort of lost count.
He was the statistician, but then he started paying more attention to baseball statistics. So.
Well, and he also keeps on his website, since he's not here, he keeps track of the number of countries he's visited.
I saw that he's traveling. It was like 138 countries or something. That's the article that I saw.
And still counting.
Yeah.
That's right.
My gosh. That's mind-blowing. So that's a great way to discover new music. When did you guys know that this was more than just a hobby?
Well, I became full-time after a concert. I was teaching psychology at what was then Lowell Tech, and Jethro Tull was on campus. I thought it would be great to bring over my class and take a look, and we were right at the adolescent psychology part of the course. So we went over and watched how people were dressed and how they were, what they were talking about. And a few of my students said, I'm with Mr. Irwin's psychology class, and talked their way in. And then we came back and we had the most vibrant conversation. It was the best class I think we ever had. Then the next morning, I had calls from the dean and the president and one other person, I don't remember who it was, saying that this was very dangerous, that we didn't have permission to take a class trip. And at the end of the semester, I was told they didn't have enough funds to rehire me. And that's when I became full-time.
Right. Well, that's a good way to do it. That's the gun to the head method.
Yeah, that's the way it usually is again.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, speaking of psychology, because this is a great lead into my next question. Marian, you seem like you're kind of a motherly influence, which I imagine is great for these artists that you are working with. Talk about developing these relationships with artists, because it's more than just the music when you sign an artist, right? It's how you get along with them. Can you talk about your relationship with artists over the years?
Well, it's interesting because Ken will often say that the best training he had for being in the record business was his psych degree.
Right.
Mine was in history, so I don't have any such excuse. But I have always been interested in that. And I think that one of the things that people who listen to music, don't stop and think about is that, in fact, the life of a musician is often a fairly isolating and isolated life. I mean, you have fans who come to shows, but of course they're only going to tell you how much they love you and how great your music is, so you're not going to hear any very sort of considered or, I hesitate to say, intelligent feedback.
Sure, and they only see one part of you as well.
That's right, and they want to be liked because they're the fans and so forth. So it's sort of our job as a record company to have the fun game of, trying to walk an even line of giving critical feedback and doing it in a constructive way. And so we try to do that. Ken works with a lot of our artists in the studio, and he tries to do that around material. But in terms of what's over the years come to be called artist relations, which didn't, of course, exist when Rounders started, started. But in terms of artist relations...
Well, they probably did, but I think they were talking about a different form.
Perhaps so. But at any rate, to try and sort of give someone the kind of active encouragement and support that they need, and also try and have them go in a direction that is going to be something that they believe in, and also something that their audience really wants as well. So it's a fascinating thing to have that kind of relationship with musicians, because none of us are musicians, which I think in fact helps us, because we're then not going to go and tell them what notes to play or what tunes we think they should record,
so
if
you can
it's
kind
not
of
something
stay out of the way on that aspect.
That's right. And encourage their own creativity, and at the same time, if they are sort of getting too carried away, try and encourage them back to the realm of what they've already started.
Right. From Big Studios in Nashville, Tennessee, this is Music Business Radio. I'm your host, David Hooper, and with me today, the Rounder founders, the founders of Rounder Records. Listen to some of these artists: Nanci Griffith, Bela Fleck, Riders in the Sky, Rush, the Tragically Hip, Godsmack, Duran Duran, and Alison Krauss. Ken Irwin and Marian and Levy are with me. You guys have been doing this for 40 years. That's a long time. Have there been any times when you guys have felt like quitting?
I ran away from home once. I didn't think that Marian and Bill were doing enough work. This was maybe 3 years into it. I hitchhiked to see this girl that I was going out with, and somewhere along the way I decided it was better to come back and make things work out. But it's been so rewarding. And most days we've awakened and really looked forward to going into work. And we also feel so strongly about the music and the musicians that we're able to help them to bring the music out and to bring enjoyment to a lot of people. When you look back, it's one of those wonderful life-type situations.
Is that passion what has kept you guys motivated?
It's a little hard to say what keeps you motivated every single day that you get up. As Ken was saying, it's a fun way to make a living. And when you look at the alternatives, we just feel incredibly blessed and incredibly fortunate to have worked with the musicians that we work with and to have been able to make a living doing something that we love. Now, does that mean that every single day you wake up and you think, oh, good, another day to go into the office or something? Not necessarily, but on the other hand, there are interesting things that you look forward to doing every single day. It's an amazing thing for us to be able to have done this.
And we have a great staff. We have a lot of people who have been with us for years and years and years, and the majority of them are really passionate about the music and just enjoy working with us as we do with them. It's fun going in and working with people, or, in this case, we're down for the Bluegrass Conference and for the show coming up. And, we have a couple of the people we work with, and it's just great to see them having so much fun and interacting. We have a Rounder sampler that we're passing out, and it's just great fun, sharing the music and being with all these other people who are passionate about the music.
I think that also something that is underplayed in our part of the record business is also how humorous it can be. And I don't mean like I have funny stories to tell. I just mean that in general, there's a lot more room for sort of humor, and you have to keep a sense of humor.
Yeah, you can't take it too seriously.
You can't, right? and in fact, hopefully you don't take yourself too seriously either. I mean, none of us have to worry about things like we're going to become the record moguls of our youth or whatever, because the record business is completely different now. But that was never our goal anyway. And as a result, you're sort of meeting new people every year, new artists every year, and it is fun. It's just, I think the fun and the humor element are both something that is a little bit underappreciated.
David Hooper here from Big Studios in Nashville, Tennessee. This is Music Business Radio. Two of the Rounder founders are here, the founders of Rounder Records, Ken Irwin and Marian and Levy. They work with artists like Ralph Stanley, Wilson Pickett, George Thorogood and the Destroyers, Buckwheat Zydeco, and Woody Guthrie. More from these guys when we come back on Music Business Radio.
Hi, my name is Doyle Davis, and I'm co-owner of Grimey's new and pre-loved music. Also just started a record label called Out of Sight Records. And you're listening to Music Business Radio.
You're listening to Music Business Radio on the web at musicbusinessradio.com.
Here at Lightning 100, we pride ourselves on spotlighting and delivering local talent to our listeners. It is with that in mind that we are proud to spotlight and deliver another local gem. Introducing Accurate Mortgage. They're in tune with the community because they are a part of it and care about it. Accurate Mortgage is locally owned and operated. Call today to talk to one of your neighbors at Accurate Mortgage. Take advantage of some of the lowest interest rates that have ever been available. On top of all of this, they are quick, closing most loans in as little as 2 to 3 weeks. Call 833-0456 or go to AccurateMTG.com today to get the ball rolling. That's 833-0456 or online at AccurateMTG.com. Local and proud of it. Call Accurate today.
Now back to Music Business Radio on Lightning 100.
Hi, I'm Favored Nation's recording artist Johnny Highland, and you're listening to Music Business Radio.
From big studios in Nashville, Tennessee, this is a special edition of Music Business Radio with the Rounder founders, 2 of the 3 founders of Rounder Records, Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. You guys have some incredible artists on this label. I've mentioned some of them, but 3,000 albums, a lot that I can't think of now. Just list some of the guys that you work with.
Well, locally, we work with Daly and Vincent, a new bluegrass group that's, won 7 awards last year at the IBMA.
Taken the world by storm.
Yep. The Grascals, who we've worked with for a number of years. Sierra Hull, a young mandolin player and singer who we first heard about from Alison Krauss, I think.
And who we're proud to say is a Berklee College of Music student up in Boston this year. Just graduated from high school, professional musician, but still pursuing her studies as well.
That's a perfect example of what you talked about earlier with musicians referring you to other musicians. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about the people you've surrounded yourself with over the last 40 years, because really, when I think of the 3 of you guys starting a record, and it sounds like a house because you said 2 of the bedrooms were your stock.
Oh, the earlier one was a no-bedroom, 3-alcove apartment that we shared with a mouse for a while until he got on Bill's chest one morning and we moved him to the railroad tracks.
Humble beginnings, and it's fun you mentioned the railroad tracks because I know that you guys are actually catching freight trains to get to where you needed to go. I mean, those are really, really humble beginnings. But it's like the little engine that could. It's keeping on my freight train motif.
That's right, Rounders on the road.
Oh, gosh. I mean, really, you had to be motivated, but you couldn't have grown this big. You were the 3rd largest independent label in the country. That's no small feat. Obviously, a huge music country here. Talk about staffing and how you bring people on and the company culture that you guys have.
Well, we're pretty fortunate, I think, over the years to have found a lot of wonderful people to work with, and we've all been interested in particular parts of the company and sort of have personally generated toward that ourselves. So, in other words, we have the kind of culture that I suppose any record company has to have, except that it's more personal and it's more intimate. And long before people were talking about things like record companies being management companies and so forth, every record company has always known that there are functions that you do for your artist when you believe in their music that are the kinds of things that make it almost more of a family situation. And I mean family in not some sort of Pollyanna-ish way. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's hard, but you're all working toward the joint project of getting the record out there and getting it around to people.
Our employees come from various sources. We've had quite a few people who've been interns who've stayed on, including our president and CEO, who graduated from Harvard Law School and knew he wanted to get into the record business and interned with us for a while. Didn't get any
salary at all.
No money.
Yeah, and then we saw his value and moved him up, and now he's been president and CEO for over 10 years.
So it really can happen when you're interning.
Yeah.
Give some advice for interns.
In the case of John or any intern, just make yourself invaluable. Sort of see what needs to be done and work with people and show you're a team player and do it with a great attitude and just, an attitude of being serious and yet,
and you will be noticed.
And you will be noticed.
Even if it doesn't seem like that might happen.
And then Brad Paul, who has played a big role in the Ryman concert that's coming up and in fact executive producing some major video productions for us and so forth, came from a radio background and had graduated from Emerson College, and we hired him right out of college. He'd done the Coffee House of the Air, which was a folk show that became very influential in the Boston area, and he's been with us ever since, so from the early 1980s until now. So we have some folks who've been with us for a long time, then some newer great people in different areas of the company.
One of my favorites is our head of publicity used to work for the WWF with Vince McMahon
well, those
Jr.
Guys know publicity.
Fighting, I believe, the arm.
Yeah.
It's an interesting combination because we do have some professionals. Sherry Sands, who's been with us for a long time and is the head of sales and general manager, worked with Sony and also with Polygram, and a number of people that work with us have been with major labels or with other independents, and others came through internship or just, fans. So it's a real variety of people we have working with them, but everybody that works with us really loves music, and that's great.
So that's a good way to find employees. The guys that are working for you, the people that are really in the business and they're proving themselves as being very passionate. Let's talk about signing stories. As I mentioned earlier in the last section, when I told people that I was interviewing you, we always get questions from listeners and they want me to ask. One of the things is they wanted me to pass along demos to you. It doesn't always happen like that, but let's talk about one of your most well-known artists, just in the mainstream, Mary Chapin Carpenter. You've got an interesting story about her, Ken.
We had heard about Chapin, as with some others, from another artist, from Kathy Fink, who lived in the Washington area. And we heard her songs for what was going to be the first record and really liked it, and we're in touch with the manager, and we started to negotiations, and we got through everything up to the point of who was going to be paying for the mastering, which at that point was probably $1,000 or $1,500, and everything was all set and came up to a holiday, and everybody took off for the holiday and thought we'd finish it up right afterwards. Someone else taking a holiday was an A&R person from down here in Nashville, and he went back home and went to see a show at the Birchmere, and lo and behold, Mary Chapin Carpenter was the opening act, and he saw her, and there we went.
Yeah.
So
you probably actually helped her out, because I'm sure that she told him, hey, well, Rounder's looking at me. So.
Right. And
bidding war.
The first record had a thank you to me in the booklet. And when it came time for her to leave her long-standing label, she remembered that Rounder had expressed interest, and her manager gave us a call, and we've signed her and put out a great record, and a Christmas record, and third record's going to be coming out shortly.
Well, it's a great example of relationships, to take it back to that. Just because something ends at one time or seems to end doesn't mean that you're not going to have it back in your life later.
Absolutely, and on such sort of slim kinds of things as like a mastering cost or something, some contracts happen or don't happen. It's almost a cliche in this business to say that it's all about relationships, but when it comes right down to it, it's true. On so many levels. Artist relationships with other artists, as we were saying before, a record company's relationship with its own traditions or not, and things like that. So it's kind of fascinating to see those sort of subtle things that are in the background or beneath the surface of what we think of as everyday reality, I guess.
Well, what about Alison Krauss? Speaking of relationships, you've been with her a long time. She's referring new artists to you now. How did you discover her?
Alison was the fiddle player and backup singer in a group way back, and it was a cassette that came in the mail. I remember I was listening on the roof of our garage, the house that we all lived in Somerville, and I had my whole stack of little memos. At that point, we actually responded to everybody who had sent us demos. I was very relaxed. It was a warm, sunny day, and I was having a great time, and I had a bottle of water out there and just listening. And the group that was sent us was a group called Classified Grass. I was listening and thought they were fairly good, and then the fourth song was Alison doing the first lead. She wasn't the lead singer in the group, and was the first and I think only time that she sang lead. And I loved her voice, which was quite different from, what you hear of Alison now. She was 13 at the time. I followed it up and contacted the manager for Classified Grass, and they gave me a reference to a person who we knew, and we called up, and he said, oh, she can be anything she wants. She can be Joe Venuti, she can be Stefan Grappelli, but I'd keep away from the vocals. And fortunately, we don't always listen to people.
Well, so she was the fourth song in. Does that happen all the time? Do you not do like a verse chorus like a lot of guys do? Do you listen?
Well, cassettes, it was a little bit hard to do verse chorus. And this was cassettes before you even had the search function where you could go to the next cut.
Yeah.
You listen to the whole thing, pretty much.
Yeah.
Mary and I do a lot of listening in the car. We live about a mile and a half away from each other, and we usually drive into work together, and we listen, and we often listen very differently, I think. Marian likes to open up the package and read and see what somebody's accomplished.
Get a feel for the artist more than the music.
And I go cold. I just, put it in and listen, and then if I like something, I'll see what somebody else has to say about it.
Right.
But we do have, I think it's 4 other people that listen, and we have weekly A&R meetings and bring the music in. There are some times where we'll get to the second cut, or, sometimes we'll listen to the whole project. But that was a day where I fortunately listened up to the 4th cut.
Yeah. This is Music Business Radio from Big Studios in Nashville. With me today, Ken Irwin and Marian Leighton Levy. They are the founders of Rounder Records, the Rounder founders. Bands like Godsmack, Duran Duran, Alison Krauss, the Tragically Hip, Rush, Riders in the Sky, Bela Fleck. So how do people send you a demo?
Usually via mail. One Rounder Way.
One Rounder Way, which is a whole nother question, how you get a street named after you. But
next time.
Give the full address.
One Rounder Way, Burlington, Massachusetts, 01803.
And the website?
Oh, and then that's care of Marian Leighton Levy. The website is www.rounder.com.
And that's care of Ken Irwin. And actually, a lot of people do contact us by email, and there are more and more people who send things via MP3s as email.
So you're open to that?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, in some ways, it's easier. And some people just will do info@rounder.com and send us things that
cool.
way.
So send a link to like maybe a MySpace page or a YouTube video. And guys, thank you so much for being here. And we're going to have you back because, speaking of busy days, another question that I'm going to ask is day in the life of Rounder Records. So that's next time on Music Business Radio when you have me here. That's right. Got to tease them.
Thank you so much, David.
We'll see you next week when I'll interview another industry guest. For more information from us, check us out online at musicbusinessradio.com.
Thank you for listening to Music Business Radio. Music Business Radio is a production of Lighting 100 Tuned In Broadcasting Incorporated, Nashville, Tennessee. Produced by Gary Crane, Dan Buckley, and David Hooper. Pro Tools post-production by Justin Hamill. Production coordination by Jesse Smith. And Lester held the cue cards. Pro audio support provided today by DigiDesign with exclusive in-studio guitars courtesy of Waterstone Musical Instruments. For more information about Music Business Radio, visit musicbusinessradio.com. We are Music Business Radio, broadcasting from WRLT Studios at Marathon Village, Nashville, Tennessee.
Music